Good morning, everyone, and welcome to FP 2020's webinar this morning, afternoon, or evening. Happy to have you join us. We'll be starting in just a minute as we allow a few more people to log in and join us. Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar hosted by Family Planning 2020 on Family Planning's return on investment. What do all the numbers mean? I'm Jason Bremner. I'm the Director for Data and Performance Management at FP 2020, and it's my pleasure to host you. Just a few logistics before we start. This is as you can see, a presentation and audio webinar. However, all of the participants are on mute, and I encourage you to ask any questions, or if you're having any technical difficulties, to use the chat box, which you can find the controls to at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions during the webinar, I have someone helping me to answer some of those basic ones on technical issues. And I will, at the end of the presentation, take a Q&A afterwards. This webinar is part of a series that FP 2020 is doing on data understanding. We appreciate your desire to better understand numbers, and today, in anticipation of the upcoming International Conference on Family Planning, we thought it a good idea to look at the main theme of the conference, which is family planning, a lifetime of returns, and to explore different estimates of return on investment to better understand what do all the numbers mean, how do they compare, why are they different. So what I hope to do in the next few minutes is walk you through some different estimates of return on investment to get a sense of the different tools, different methodologies, and different outputs from these different estimates, or of these different estimates. All right, next slide, please. So I'll go through an overview of 4 different approaches. And the next slide, please. So that we can better understand some of the different communications that, that you may see about family planning's return on investment. And these are just some quotes that are pulled from different sources. And you can see here in the upper left that you may see estimates such as every dollar spent on contraceptive services in developing regions saves $2.20 in maternal and newborn health care. You may see very different numbers as the one on the lower left, which says for every dollar invested in family planning, the analysis says society reaps $120 in lifetime benefits, such as reduced maternal and child deaths and increased per capita income. So this is a very different estimate from that $2.20, and we want to explore why are they so different. The quote on the upper right is a similar estimate to the one I just read. It comes out to $120 per dollar spent. That was featured in The Economist a few years ago. And then here on the lower right, you may sometimes see a quote like this one, which says, for every US dollar invested in family planning, up to $6 can be saved in interventions aimed at achieving other development goals. So this is just a smattering of quotes that we've selected, but you can see here a wide range of estimates from $2.20, another at $6, another at $120 for each dollar invested. And so what I hope to explore with you all is why these are different, and then what we can say given this wide range of estimates. Next slide, please. So to say that each of those quotes is different is in part because they come from very different pieces of research and analysis. And I'm showing here 4 different sources and 4 different approaches that have been used to measure return on investment. I just want to clarify that these are just 4 recent ones, but in fact, the family planning community has been working to understand the economics of family planning for a long time, for decades actually, and has been using an economic argument for investing in family planning for decades. The numbers that I've selected here are more recent ones that you will see, and the studies that you see on the screen here include Adding It Up, done by the Guttmacher Institute. The lower left, the Copenhagen Consensus Center, a special paper on population and demography that was done in 2011. Some work from the Health Policy Project. Actually, this was, I believe, the Health Policy one, and this was done in 2006 by the Futures Group. And a more recent one up on the upper right, looking at modeling the demographic dividends. So these are 4 more recent approaches, but just to say there are many more that have been done over the years, and I'll talk about a resource that we're putting together to feature a number of different analyses beyond these 4 that I'll cover today. Next, please. So let's turn to the first approach, and this is Adding It Up by the Guttmacher Institute to better understand this $2.20 number. Next, please. So this is the main graphic that comes out of the Guttmacher Institute's work. And you may be familiar with Adding It Up because Adding It Up is a study that looks at unmet need for modern contraceptives. And essentially it takes an approach of what if we were to meet all of that unmet need? What would happen? What would be the impact? What would be the cost? And what would be the benefit? And so here it is a cost-benefit analysis. And what you'll see between these 3 graphics are on the far left, the current levels of contraceptive and maternal neonatal health care. And so that's at current levels. And the current cost, here if you look closely, is this green, well, these bars all look a little green, but the upper green bar, which is $6.3 billion across all developing regions. And then they suppose, what if we were to meet all unmet need, and how much would it cost? And that is the upper, on the third bar to the right, the upper section, it would cost nearly double what we're spending now, so $12.1 billion. And then they look at what would be the cost of caring for both intended and unintended pregnancies. And you can see between the second and the third bar, you can see an increase in the cost from 6.3 billion to 12 billion. You can also see a decrease in cost of maternal neonatal health care from the reduction in unintended pregnancies. And you can see that that goes from 16.8 billion to 4.2 billion. So what we see here is an increase in cost of modern contraceptives that reduces unintended pregnancy, and therefore you have less costs of care for those unintended pregnancies. So this it's a very mathematical approach. It's based in our understanding of unmet need and in the costs of meeting that need and in the costs of care. And so what you see here, next slide please, is that if you do this math, which is if you want to get into more depth, the researchers at Guttmacher provide all of these spreadsheets and resources, but you essentially come down to this $1 in contraceptives results in $2.20 in savings in maternal and newborn health care due to declines in unintended pregnancy. So this is a narrow approach in its look at preventing unintended pregnancies. So we're just looking at the healthcare savings. So we're going to compare this next to a couple of other approaches to understand better why some of the other estimates are different and larger in other cases. Next slide, please. So I'm going to juxtapose. This approach that looks at an annual cost, and I'm just going to pause here to go back to Guttmacher and say that's an annual cost and the annual benefits, to a longer-term approach of the demographic dividend, which is looking at what is the long-term impact of a change in fertility due to investments in family planning and other sectors. And so now we're looking at a long-term approach versus the short-term approach of adding it up. Next slide, please. So this long-term approach here in Kenya can be characterized by a very different population pyramid across two different scenarios for 2050. So again, what we're looking at here is what would the impact on fertility and age structure be over a long period of time. And in the demographic dividend model, you can compare different scenarios and see their impact on both the population age structure and the economy. But we are looking at scenarios out to 2050. So this is not immediate impact. The Guttmacher study was looking at annual short-term impacts and health savings. This is looking at long-term economic gains. So let's turn to the next slide. I don't want to go through all of the economics of the model, and you probably don't want me to either. So I'll just say that there are many resources available on the demographic dividend model and the methodologies. But to say here that you can create different scenarios in this approach by changing the blue boxes on the top, you can have changes in the population age structure, the total population. You can also, in scenarios, change things related to education, which you can see on the right-hand side, as well as several economic variables. And you can compare different scenarios, ultimately to get at this bottom square at the bottom of this graphic, at a different gross domestic product per capita in 2050. So next slide, please. So returning to a case here of Kenya, these applications of the demographic dividend model are done at a country level because you're creating complicated scenarios in a country, and it's essentially been used as an analysis and advocacy tool with decision makers in particular countries to show the impact of an investment in family planning. You can see that they show on the far left a current GDP per capita. Then they show a 2050 base scenario in which you don't invest any further in family planning, and there's not much age structure change, and there's also no changes here in the economic and education variables. And then you can see three scenarios beyond that that look at different changes in economic variables, economics and education, and then finally at the end, a full demographic dividend scenario of adding together changes in economics, education, and family planning. And you can see that marginal increase in GDP per capita in 2050 based on these changes. So very different approach from the Guttmacher, which was looking at health and pregnancy care savings in 1 year. And this is looking at a long-term approach looking at GDP per capita. Now you'll notice that there's no $1 in, a dollar out estimate here. So this is looking at a long-term GDP per capita change, but it doesn't cost out the family planning component or the other components to get at that. So that's something that you can't get from this type of model. And we're going to compare this to in the next two approaches to see how one could cost this and therefore come up with a different type of estimate. So we'll turn to next approach. Next slide, please. And this approach was actually done in the era of the Millennium Development Goals, making the case that the contribution of family planning in development would also aid in achieving other Millennium Development Goals. So each of these different approaches has been used at a different time, often in the context of that time to make the case. So this is one that's very particular, but it is the underpinning of an earlier $1 to $6 estimate that I quoted. And so we'll look at this and just to get a sense of what was done and why do we see this particular number and how does it differ from the other ones. So next slide, please. So you'll have to apologize, or I'll have to apologize, and you'll have to forgive me. There aren't a lot of pretty graphics in this particular paper. So I've put these up here so that you can study these at length after this meeting to better understand what was done. I think the important thing to note here are that a set of countries on the left side was analyzed. And you can see that these countries are all in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that on the top of this table, a whole host of different sectors were analyzed. And these were sectors that were part of the MDGs, where there were goals in education, immunization, water and sanitation, maternal health, and malaria. And here, again, the analysts here looked at comparing a case where you would meet unmet need and then look at the impact on the cost of achieving different MDG targets in these areas. So they did use a cost here, a cost of family planning, and that is that's what you can see in the family planning column. And then they also are then looking across the different sectors at what the benefits would be. And so you get a cost to benefit ratio like you saw in Guttmacher, but you're getting this in a very different way because you're looking at not the savings in these sectors, but the savings in achieving a particular goal. And a lot of this is achieved because there are fewer pregnancies and then there are fewer services needed. And this is largely a population change impact. Now, so these are these numbers when we look at the next slide. Will give us very different cost to benefit ratios across the countries that were analyzed. Now, I quoted a $1 to $6 number earlier, and you can see that that $6 number comes from here, Senegal, but you can see a wide range of benefit to cost ratio here, from a low in Ethiopia of $1 invested in family planning, giving you $2 in MDG savings benefits versus the $6 in Senegal. So to say there is often a different cost to benefit ratio across countries, and there are a lot of reasons for that. One is that the family planning costs are different in countries based on the methods used, based on the need, and so here we're getting very different costs, but also there are different benefits because the costs of the other services in those countries can be very different. It also suggests that communications-wise, one could just pick this $1 to $6 and say, look, we've got a $1 to $6 cost-benefit ratio, but it's really not true to the table. And I note that when my colleagues who did this work actually quote from this study, they say the range of benefits could be between $2 and $6, and that more accurately characterizes the work rather than just picking the highest number on the table and saying one could achieve up to $6. So communications and accurate communications around return on investment, I think, is really critical. All right, and next approach, please. So finally, I want to turn to the $1 to $120 approach, which was done in 2011 as a series of papers that were meant to compare development interventions in the context of the post-2015 development agenda. So as the Sustainable Development Goals didn't exist at that time, and there were many conversations about what would come after the MDGs, the Copenhagen Consensus Center chose to do a comparison analysis of different approaches, and to say family planning came out as one of the most cost-effective interventions in this comparison series. But all of these papers were done as to be comparable with one another. So the methodology chosen here is a little different than the ones that we've looked at, and we'll look at that in a bit more depth to understand that $1 to $120 cost benefit or return on investment ratio. Okay, next slide, please. So again, this one is a very long paper. I encourage folks to read it, but it is it does not have a lot of pretty graphics that are going to walk you through it. And what I'm going to do is just give you a basic understanding of the approach and what is measured so that you can get a better sense of why the 120 is so different from the 2 to 6 or the 2. So what you see here first are that these analysts took the approach of first, similar to Guttmacher and the MDG paper, taking a scenario of what if you met all unmet need. And so what you'll see in the column that has 3.6 billion US dollars is an annual. So this $3.6 billion actually comes from an earlier Guttmacher study. So you know, if you were paying attention closely here, that this cost more recently in 2017 has a very different estimate. It's now almost 6 billion, but in 2010, this was the best estimate that was available. And so the cost of meeting all unmet need annually in developing countries was 3.6 billion. And then they looked at what would be the benefits. And they looked at benefits in 2 ways. They looked, 1, at reduced infant and maternal mortality, and then 2, at a longer term approach like the demographic dividend, what would be the income growth over time. So the $120 is a combination of both a short-term gain from reduced infant and maternal mortality and a long-term gain from age structure changes and the demographic dividend. And so we've put these 2 together, or these are put together in ranges of cost-benefit ratios of short-term and long-term. Now, I just want to say that the approach that they took here was a little bit different than the Guttmacher Institute, in that instead of measuring healthcare savings, they actually used disability adjusted life year approach. I don't have time to get deeply into this, but to say that they basically took each disability adjusted life year, valued it, and then used that to get a benefit. And so this was done because all of these prior studies that I was mentioning were trying to compare development approaches needed a similar way of value. And so here they took a lives saved approach versus a healthcare savings approach. And that is what we see in the reduced infant maternal mortality. So what we're looking at is a cost, or a cost of meeting all unmet need, a benefits in annual benefits of lives saved, infant and maternal mortality, and a long-term approach of income growth. And when we look at the ranges here, you get a range between 90 billion and 150 billion in annual benefits, and in the middle of that is our $120 per dollar invested. Say it's a very different approach. It looks at a short-term and a long-term gain, and it takes a different approach at, it takes a similar approach in costing the intervention, takes a different approach in looking at the benefits. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I hope that you will have noticed that many of the benefits of family planning that have been voiced over the last several years, particularly now with the Sustainable Development Goals, aren't actually measured in the prior studies on cost-benefit analysis. And we know from some papers that family planning has a benefit on a whole host of the Sustainable Development Goals. And only a few of these have been captured till now in the approaches that have been taken on return on investment. I'm happy to report that there's some work being done by the Health Policy Plus project that's looking at the broader set of impacts on the Sustainable Development Goals. And in fact, next slide, please. This approach that's being taken now is actually looking at or has created a model on the family planning and the SDGs that looks at the impact on 13 different sustainable development goal sectors. And you can see just a few selected here, 8 different ones, but they are looking at poverty, at food security, at health, as we've seen in some of the other ones, also impacts on education, water sanitation, and the income growth impacts. Now, I think it's important to note that not all of these are easily monetized. So rather than try to get at a new number in which you could monetize all of these benefits and therefore get maybe something larger than $120, they're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals individually and looking at the impact on those. Very hard to monetize all of these. And just to say that our current numbers of $1 to $2 or $1 to $120 have looked at a very narrow slice that we've been able to monetize, but there are many other impacts that aren't yet captured. So I just want to make clear that the $1 to $120 estimate isn't bigger because it's looking at more sectors. It's bigger because it's looking at more time. But if one were to look at more sectors, I probably come up with very different numbers, though the calculations would be really hard to do, and I think our accuracy might suffer. So to say that that this is a different and I think more comprehensive approach is exciting, but it's not going to give us a new return on investment number. All right, I'll turn to what I believe is close to the last slide and then turn to questions and answers. Next, please. So we see these very different estimates from different models. Some of these vary by country. Some of them were done globally. Adding it up, you can actually get you can get regional analysis that looks at the cost-benefit ratio for different regions. The Copenhagen consensus was done across all developing regions. I showed you that the MDG report was done by country. The demographic dividend model is done specifically in country. The family planning SDGs model also is being done through a country application. So depending on whether you do these globally, over a short term or a long term, you can get very different numbers. And it's not to say that that we don't know what we're talking about and that we come up with very different numbers because we take totally different approaches. It also is because of scale, both time and geographic. Next slide, please. So as we go into the International Conference on Family Planning, we're hoping to provide you with a resource that explains these different approaches. FP 2020 has put together a one-pager that will be included in family planning, in the family planning conference bags that explains different approaches and why they're different. Next slide, please. And we will also be providing a table which shows a comparison of these different approaches. So this table will also be on the back side of that brief and provide participants in the conference with sort of a crib sheet of why are these numbers so different and what do they all mean. So just to close here, I want to say that all of these approaches, regardless of which one you choose, make a strong investment case for family planning. They all characterize family planning as best buy. They are, however, all very different, and accurately communicating the results will help to reduce confusion. And so clear and correct communication, we hope, will help us as advocates, as analysts, to be credible, so that we don't, so that those who are audiences don't feel like we're giving them a whole range of different estimates that don't make sense. I've mentioned that I think there's a continued opportunity for improvement and expansion of these efforts. The family planning SDGs model is one example. But as I've already seen in some of the questions and notes that are coming in, people are saying, well, these seem like old estimates. And it's true. Other than the adding it up estimate, which is regularly reanalyzed, the MDGs analysis was done in an era, and one could say it's no longer relevant in the current development context. And the Copenhagen consensus number was done the analysis was done in 2010. The actual numbers that they were able to rely on at that time were from 2008 to 2010, so they're almost a decade old. And some of the ways in which we've measured the costs of family planning and the benefits have changed. And so if one were to redo that analysis, you could get different numbers just based on our better understanding of costs and of benefits. So there's good opportunity for those of you who are researchers and analysts to continue to be active in this field. It's been going on for decades, and it likely will continue for decades as we continue to need to make the case for family planning through an economic argument. So I'll stop there and hope that that I was clear and and that you have lots of interested and exciting questions. If I wasn't clear, now's your time to ask those questions that for clarification. So please, again, if you have questions, feel free to use the chat button. So I see a question coming in about who the appropriate audiences are for these different estimates. For example, what's the best estimate to use to advocate for a budget line for contraceptives? Thanks, that's a, a great question. I think several of these could be used for making the case, and I think in terms of the appropriate audiences, it does depend on the country in which one is working. I think a lot of the more recent focus has been on finance ministers and sometimes governors, those who are controlling purse strings and controlling budgets, as opposed to the family planning decision makers who don't need to be convinced to invest in family planning. That, I think in that case, there's a real need for country-specific numbers, and some of the applications that I mentioned of demographic dividend have been done very specifically in a country with those country scenarios to look at what would be the long-term benefits of investing in family planning. I think one of the tricks to that, though, is that there aren't numbers that are supporting that analysis at a short-term scale. So you can use a combination of these numbers, and I think it's a good strategy is to say, the near-term benefits could be, between $2.20 $2.20 of savings, depending on the region, in immediate health and pregnancy care savings, and long-term gains in economics, in economic growth. And I think trying to use both a savings and an economic growth communications approach will benefit those of you who are trying to reach those finance audiences. Okay, lots of different questions coming in, so you'll just have to give us a second to get organized here. Okay, the next one is about the demographic dividend model. Is the demographic dividend model based on countries that have already experienced this dividend, like some Asian countries? How do increases in MCPR affect the return on investment? The models you mentioned talked about meeting unmet need. Is MCPR also a factor? So I'm going to differentiate between the demographic dividend model and the other meeting unmet need models. The demographic dividend model is based on economic research, and I'm just presenting one demographic dividend model here, but there are actually several demographic dividend models that have been the subject of past webinars that I've participated in on demographic dividend. And each of these, yes, is based on empirical evidence from Asian countries, and then looking at how that also has, how change has also taken place in some sub-Saharan African countries. And then those are then applied in the sub-Saharan African, largely in a sub-Saharan African context. So empirical based and based on the experience in Asian countries, but with more recent information coming out of World Bank, some World Bank studies and others on the demographic dividend in Africa. Then the second part of this question is, how do increases in MCPR affect return on investment? So if you look at the underpinning of what meeting unmet need means, it is largely an increase in MCPR that is bringing about that that unmet need being satisfied. So unmet need could be met in two ways. One would be through an increase in MCPR. Other would be through a decrease in need in people expressing need, and this is really solely through an increase in MCPR. So that is the factor that results in an increase in unmet need being met. Confusing sequence of words there. But if you look at the Guttmacher study and the others, they're essentially saying contraceptive costs go up. That is due to an increase in MCPR. All right, I'm going to work my way down through the questions here. Okay, so a question coming in on, curious to hear your thoughts on the return on investment of investing in male contraceptive methods. Has there been an effort to identify the financial impact of increased male methods? These particular approaches have not looked at one method versus another. So what we aren't seeing here are comparisons of different contraceptive methods or of male versus female-based methods, or of short-acting versus long-acting or permanent methods. So I did mention earlier that there are different costs, and cost has a lot to do with the method mix in a country. but I'm not aware of someone looking at the benefits versus the different costs based on different types of contraceptives. So that's not been the focus thus far. And it could be that there are other studies that have looked more specifically at cost-benefit ratios for particular methods. I'm not aware of them, and feel free if you are aware of them to link them into the chat. And of course, we can make the webinar is being recorded, and all of these questions can be made available, so those resources would be available for others. So I see a question here about if one had to come up with an elevator speech on the different approaches, would it be accurate to characterize the differences or the bottom line differences to being principally about the different look at time horizons and global versus country specific? And I think that yes, the biggest difference between the $2 to 20 cents and the $120 and is not about the more things being measured. It's about time. It's about different time horizons, looking at short-term or long-term, or a combination of those. And so that $1 to $120, I think it's best when one communicates that, or if one is trying to explain the differences, that one say that yes, the big difference is looking at a short-term and a long-term gain together to look at a long time horizon, but largely across the health sector and its impact on economic growth. So that's the big difference there. It's not about more sectors being measured. And you want to be real careful, because sometimes people think that because the Copenhagen consensus number was done in the context of evaluating lots of development interventions, that the analysts looked at a whole host of different impacts. And they didn't. They looked at two principal things, as I said, lives saved and economic growth, and they put them together. So yes, I think it would be accurate in explaining those different approaches to say that the big underpinning is the time horizon and the global versus country specific approaches. So I see lots of questions. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them during the webinar, I can already see, but I'm doing my best here. I'll try to speed up my answers. There was a question of, can the approaches be simplified further? Our audiences may not be great with lots of numbers. I think the answer is sure, absolutely. We try to do that in the one pager that we're providing. And we will be providing that online. The resource will be available to all of you who've participated, and available through the FP 2020 website, and can be found on the FP 2020 measurement hub. And so please feel free to go there, use this one pager. We'll provide a link to it, I hope, in the chat box. And I encourage you to use that rather than to use this particular PowerPoint presentation, which was really meant to help all of you better understand the numbers. All right, other questions here.
Sorry, folks, we're just having a little bit of a technical difficulty, but we'll try to get Jason back on the line. In the meantime, we'll see if we can address some of the additional questions that have come in. I see a question that mentions the fact that some of the models talk about long-term benefits, but the issue is that a lot of ministries of finance need money in the short term. So I think this is a case where these models can be useful, but there's also additional data that is sort of necessary to make the case for family planning. So while you can communicate about the economic benefits of investing in family planning in the long term, there are also short-term benefits in terms of maternal health and mortality and neonatal health and child mortality as well. And I think those arguments can be made in combination with some of the longer-term estimates produced by the different models we saw, such as the MDGs, the SDGs, and the SDG model and the demographic dividend model. And I see another comment about the impact model, also allowing users to enter different method mixes and see the different cost benefit ratios. I think this is a good point, because while you do have the models that Jason presented articulating the return on investment, there are additional impact analyses that can be done with method mix data, as well as with inputs from MCPR to sort of project some shorter term benefits or impacts of investment in family planning. All right, we're running up on the end of our time for this webinar. I want to thank everyone for joining and for sending so many questions. So this is a topic that sparks a lot of interest from the family planning community, and it's an important one, as Jason mentioned, especially in light of the theme of the upcoming International Conference on Family Planning. So please do keep an eye out for the one-page document on ROI, which we are in the process of finalizing, and which will be made available at ICFP, but will also be communicated through FB 2020's channels. So please make sure you're on our email listserv, which you should be if you got this invitation. And feel free to send us any additional questions you have. We'll send out a follow-up email to all registrants with the recording of the webinar, as well as the PowerPoint and a link to the ROI fact sheet. So you'll be getting all these materials. Thanks again, everyone, for spending, making time to participate in this webinar. And we will be in touch and hope to see you at ICFP. Thank you.